So my story is actually not why me. It's a ghost story because it's October. So we should hear ghost stories. So, all right. I was born in Burke, Virginia, which is not very far from here. My parents were Northerners that came from the New York area. So they moved down here. My dad went to school, and they decided to stay. And they bought a house in the suburbs way out in Burke, Virginia, on a school teacher's salary, my mom's salary. So it was a townhouse in the middle of nowhere. Because back in the 80s, Burke, Virginia was like the middle of nowhere. We literally we were in a townhouse, and the back of the townhouse looked straight out at a field, and behind that field was a farm. And there was a lake and a farm. And the only reason I knew that because there was a line of trees, a tall line of trees, so about 10 feet tall. The only reason we knew there was a farm back there when I was a child was because you would hear horses stampeding, and you'd hear dogs chasing the horses. And again, to my parents and their like northern sensibilities, this was insane. They were city people. This made no sense. They did not bond with the South. They didn't like it. They weren't here for the horses or the history. They were here for the cheap land and the opportunities to work in DC, and that was kind of it. So I just grew up, running out in this field in the backyard. And there was a field, and then about 30 feet of this backyard, there were these, again, very tall line of trees. So one day, I am about 4 years old, and the light had just changed. It was springtime. It was that first long night of spring. And I was sitting at the kitchen table, and the kitchen table faced the window, and the window faced the backyard. And I'm sitting and I'm eating. At the time, I'm an only child. My mom is making dinner. She is sitting, she's at the stove right here, and she's got her back turned to the window, and I'm looking out, and I'm kind of like, doing the things kids do, kind of off in space, and then I see, all at once, as if from nowhere, these 4 very tall men step out in unison from the trees, as if from out of thin air. And they are marching in unison, and they're dressed in a way that I've never seen before as a child. And they are carrying these very long sticks, these sticks that they've kind of hoisted up on their hands. And these sticks are almost as tall as the trees, and these are very tall trees. And they're marching towards us, and towards the back of the house. There was the basement, and there were doors. And I was saying, "Mom, who are those men?" And she turned around and she said, "What men? What are you talking about?" And I was like, "Those men right there that are marching towards the door." And she said, "Honey, there's nobody there. There's nobody there." And I think I grew up in a house, thank goodness, where my parents, it was a very safe place. I had a very safe house. So, I wasn't too concerned, because when your parents tell you something's okay, you kind of just think that things are okay. I didn't really question it, but I was very concerned because the men were marching closer and closer to our house, and then I saw them get almost to the door, and then they just disappeared into thin air. And I thought that was very strange, even as a child. And I would say to my mom, I said, "Did you see those men? They just disappeared." And she'd go, "Oh, you have such an active imagination." Because that was my thing. I had imaginary friends. But I knew the difference between imaginary friends and something that I could see in front of my eyes. And I could tell the difference. And these were things that I actually saw. So the next night, same thing. I'm sitting at dinner. We always ate dinner at the same time. And as if out of thin air, these 4 men step out from the trees, and they start marching in unison towards me. I said, Mom. She goes, "Honey, there's nobody there. There's nobody ever there." And they marched, disappeared. And this happened all summer long. The entire time the light was long. It just became something that I saw. I'm going to blow through that time. And I said to myself, this is very strange, because normally, I would go out in after when I would play out, and I would go up to the line of trees, and there was a fence right behind these trees. So I'd go and I'd try to squeeze between the trees, and I'd say, "Mom, can you see me?" And she'd say, "Of course I can see you, like your butt's sticking out." So there's no possible way for anyone to be hiding back there. And what I noticed was whenever they'd step out from the trees wouldn't rustle. And I would hear the dogs barking and the horses running. And that's how I knew that these men were coming. So then in the fall, the light changed, and I never saw this again. And then in the spring, my brother was born, and we moved to be farther away. And I didn't think about this for such a long time. I thought to myself, I don't know, I had a very overactive imagination when I was a kid. Maybe I was just imagining things. But a few years ago, I was at a party, and I met this woman who did war reenactments from wars long ago. She did Revolutionary War reenactments, she did Civil War reenactments, and while this was not my kind of a hobby, she said, would you like to see pictures? And I said, sure, because I am polite. And she took out her camera and she said, this was from a reenactment. This was a Civil War reenactment. And these were just some guys. They were dressed up as a troop. And she pulled out a camera, and there in this picture was a line of men. There were 4 men, and they were dressed with brass buttons, and they had long rifles with bayonets. And I said, oh my God, these were the men that I saw. Exactly. I pictured it. From the way I remembered everything. I remembered the hats, I remembered the buttons, I remembered the way that they carried their guns. I said, do you have video of them walking? She did. They were marching in 4 abreast, exactly as they were marching all those times that I saw them. And I said, is this like accurate? She said, this is, as far as we knew, this was how troops went out. They always marched 4 abreast, they always carried their bayonets, they walked. And I said, that's insane, because I've been seeing these men. I saw these men appear from thin air for all those years. And I said to myself, I should look up where I lived, because where I lived was, again, I don't know much of the history because I was so little, but I Googled where I lived, I put in the coordinates, and I Googled like Civil War, battles or whatever, and what I found was less than 1/3 of a mile away from that house that I grew up in was a place called Burke Station. Burke Station was one of a fairly large battle that was fought between the Union soldiers and the South. And there was this big battle, and what happened was they had all of these Union soldiers that were sneaking all around in the woods, and then you had these other soldiers. And again, my head was spinning, because what I thought was, because these soldiers had to be sent out to scout for things like apparently wood and scout for locations, every night at dusk, these men were forced to go back to the station. So I thought to myself, if I believe any of this, which for me was hard not to, what could this be other than maybe the memories or the ghosts of these soldiers that were forever walking back to their post? And that was the only thing that made sense to me. And what I thought was, it wasn't the thought of dying in battle or dying at all that made me sad or scared. It was the idea that this battle ended in the 1860s. And the fact that now, when I saw this was in the 1980s, and 100 and like whatever years, 25 years later, these men were eternally marching to their next post. And I thought to myself, I might not be afraid of death, but I'm certainly afraid of never being able to leave and being trapped forever in that march home. That's my story.